Hello and welcome to a Total Education Centre lecture. My name's Bruce Pattinson and tonight I'm going to talk to you about the language techniques and the dramatic techniques a little bit in the Tempest. I'm answering questions from students at this stage, and a lot of my class will know that they wrote these questions, but they're general questions that students all over the world will be able to look at and understand. And I'll talk very briefly a little bit about essay technique at the start, just to give you some indication of how that you use these language elements. And the first thing I'd like to talk about is the language of Shakespeare. And lots of students in their essay get carried away with talking about iambic pentameter and what iambic pentameter is and what it does and all about it, and explain it and go on for a page sometimes, and even 3/4 of a page. And they just give all those definitions of what iambic pentameter is, and they show the rhyme scheme, and they talk about how it's used and what it does and Shakespeare, and they never actually get to talk about its effect on the play and its impact and why it's used and what it does. And they're the things that get you marks. The definition and knowledge of iambic pentameter and the prose and all those sorts of things is excellent, but you really need to focus when you talk about techniques on what effect that technique has, why it's used, and you know, it's not just its effect in the play in this instance, but it's also effect in our case on the audience, and how Shakespeare uses that to shape the audience's perception of what's being said and seen on stage. And when we talk about that, we need to think about what it does. So for example, in the Tempest, we've got those two things, and students often get carried away about talking about when Caliban uses prose and when he uses poetic language, and you know, give you quotes from both, and that's all fine, but what does it show us about Caliban? And if you go back to that lecture I talked about, when I talked about Caliban, you'll learn some of those things. And yes, he does talk in prose and he does talk in poetic language at times, and there are specific points, and you need to look at those specific points and talk about them very, very carefully. It's no use just saying yes he talks in prose and yes he talks in poetry without explaining why and what the purpose is. So that's a good place to get started on getting you into the why, and then its effect on the audience. What does it show us about Caliban? What is it saying about his character? And there are other characters in the play, such as Ariel, who also talk in poetic language occasionally and prose at times. Trinculo and Stefano, for example, don't talk in the poetic language at all. They are too drunk most of the time. And so you need to look at why that is and what happens there and all those sorts of things. So for students in my class, we need to think about and talk about the effect and what it shows us about discovery, but students in other places will have very specific purposes and reasons. I'd also like to point out at this stage, and I've just jotted this down as a reminder, these lectures, the three of them, have been about character, but when we answer questions in an essay, we probably would be looking at very specific scenes and what those scenes show about those characters. And you wouldn't talk about the whole narrative and you wouldn't retell the story. You'd pick out very particular scenes that illustrate what you want to see. So for example, you know, the opening scenes of the Tempest, what do they show us? In my case, my class is doing an essay on discovery. So what do they show us about discovery? Well, Miranda discovers her past, for example, and the characters discover an island, and there's all those sorts of things that you need to talk about, and the techniques that are brought into those, and I'll talk about those later, and the effect of those. So that's the way I would approach it. I'd like to reinforce the point here that we never retell the narrative, okay? And that's nearly as important as saying we don't list the techniques. So for example, the questions that I got from students talk about, how do I find good techniques? What are some strong techniques? All those sorts of questions. And so when we talk about technique, students are inclined to, when they find one, they're inclined to list them. So for example, at the start of your essay, and you know, many students make the mistake of doing this, Shakespeare uses the techniques. He uses oxymoron, hyperbole, antithesis, and imagery in a long block like that, and then don't go back and refer to them, or they give you one example and move on. And you know, I've got examples of all those specific techniques here, but we need to look at a little bit more than that. So choose scenes that are very specific to you. So for example, you need to choose, I would choose sections from different elements of the play. So in 5 acts you've got those 5 key elements. You've got exposition in Act 1, complication in Act 2, climax in Act 3, falling action in Act 4, and then the catastrophe or resolution in that final act, Act 5. And so you need to think about where you're going to choose those from and what's the purpose of the scenes that you're choosing. And the scenes that you are comfortable with are the scenes that you should choose. And that works out, I think, best for students to write about things they feel comfortable with rather than trying to force what you're doing. So let's look at some now specific techniques. So for example, if we talk about the use of asides, and I'll start with that. Miranda, Act 1, Scene 2, where she talks about Prospero and the concept of truth. What does that tell us? What does an aside do? Well, an aside is an additional comment to the audience that the audience is letting on, that the other characters in the play don't understand. And it's usually a comment about something very particular and personal that explains a lot about the character who gives that aside. It also drags the audience into creating a sense of empathy. And so when you look at a technique, you need to talk about those sorts of things. One little technique that I'd warn you about is the use of the word soliloquy in The Tempest. Now, some critics have suggested that Prospero's final speech is a soliloquy, and certainly you can use that. Some critics and other academics argue that it's not a soliloquy, it's just a direct aside to the audience, but a very long one. It doesn't really matter what you say, it's what you do with it. And I think that he doesn't use the soliloquy in The Tempest in a way that he would use it in, say, the tragedies like Hamlet and all those sorts of plays. And you need to just think about what it does and why is he directly talking to the audience and why does Shakespeare finish the play that way. And I think it gives us a nice resolution as the audience leaves. They feel they've been addressed and spoken to, and all the magic sort of disappeared and they go back into the real world, just as Prospero is. So let's have a look at some of those very specific symbols that we get in The Tempest. And let's probably start with something simple like the Tempest itself. And the Tempest in the play as a symbol represents the political and personal upheaval in the play and is a good example of disorder. So when we talk about the Tempest, we can see that the rightful order of things has been overthrown. That's the political concept of it. And there's personal upheaval too, and you know, the idea of taking a leader and pushing them aside and taking their spot and all those sorts of things. And you notice that the resolution in the end, he talks very clearly about how the Tempest is quietened in Act 5, and we go back to calm seas. And I think that's a very important image that you need to track through and see how all the little tempestuous acts all the way through calm down at the end in that final resolution. So that's a nice way to, that's a nice technique, and you can look at the use of the Tempest as an image in that. Also, the Tempest, you know, in the case of our essay, for example, it leads us into lots and lots of discoveries, and we've already talked about that in class, and you can go over those sorts of things. Another idea and concept and a symbol in the play is the idea of books. And books are very important as a source, not only a discovery of Prospero's power and his secret studies, but he takes them with him into exile. That's how important they are. He's being cast out on a small boat, you know, that's rats are leaving because it's leaky, with his daughter, and he still takes his books with him. And that shows their importance, and that shows the power of the book and the importance of learning. And we can also discover that he needs his books till that final resolution when he gives them up saying, "I'll drown my book." And it's very important to remember that the books are a symbol of learning and a symbol of the magic, and he gives those away in the end to go back into the real world. And I think they're an otherworldly thing in this case, and certainly lead him on to better things. I'd like to talk about the idea of chess as a sport and as a symbol again in the play. It's a game where you have to capture and or take or kill the king, And I think that's very important in the context of the Tempest, the idea of the Tempest and the political upheavals in the play. And you can bind those two things together very well. Prospero likes playing chess. The characters in fact are pawns that Prospero moves around throughout most of the play, and I think that's an interesting idea. And yet you find at the end that Miranda and Ferdinand are playing chess, and that's a nice segue into the idea that those final manipulations and the game's going to be over as those two join together and unite. I'd like to talk also another technique that he uses in the play is the masque. The masque is very rare in Shakespeare's plays, and he uses this in the Tempest very effectively and very well. And one wonders in this last play why he didn't use it more frequently. In the masque, the emphasis is on spectacle and elaborate staging. There's certainly a more formal language because a masque is a very formal occasion. And here we have the banquet scene and the wedding scene. I'd like to give you a definition of masque where you can work with it and what we learn from that masque. A masque was a form of aristocratic entertainment in England in the 16th and 17th centuries, originally consisting of pantomime and dancing, but later including dialogue and song, which is what we see in Shakespeare, presented in more elaborate productions. And I think Shakespeare at the end goes all out to impress the audience, and the masque is a really big scene and very overblown, and he has gods come down and all these sorts of things. And I think that's very effective on an audience basis, and the audience can discover a lot about theatre through that as well. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the motifs, the recurring ideas or themes in that play. And one of those ideas is the master or servant, for example. That's one idea. And here we have Prospero with Caliban and Ariel. You can refer to that. Alonso with Gonzalo, the nobility with the boatswain, and Stefano and Caliban. And they're all master and servant images that I've sort of dealt with in those character studies, and I probably won't go back over, or can't have time to go back over them now. But if you go back and look at the other 3 lectures in this series, you'll certainly learn something about those things. What's another motif? Well, water, for example. Water imagery abounds in this play, and of course with the Tempest and the sea and being on an island, but there's lots and lots of water imagery, and you can go through the play and note those water images for yourself and look for those as you go through. It plays a crucial role in the text, and water is extremely important, and it's mentioned many, many times. What else can we talk about? We can talk about the hyphenated words in the play, and Shakespeare in his language discovered many, many words, and the focus, he did discover them in many ways, and a lot of the words that he discovered and added to the English language are these hyphenated words like hag, born, and all those sorts of things that you'll see in the play. And you can go through and note those and note where he uses them, and often they're insults, and we see that they're a very deep and long-lived insult, and that's very important. Another motif that I'd like to point out to you that aid the sort of techniques and discovery in the play is that the noises and the music. And we see lots of noises and we have lots of music, and one of the scenes that you might like to choose might include a little bit of noise and a little bit of music, so you can talk about that and what it does. And often the music's associated with the magic, and Ariel will whistle a tune or lumber tune, and it's also part of the comedy. And so that music comes into it, and that's a very theatrical thing, and Shakespeare does that so the audience is allowed into the play and discover a little bit more. So, in finishing off now, because I am running out of time for this lecture, let's look at some of the very specific techniques that I mentioned at the start that I'll finish off with, so people can reference those and think for yourself what they do. So, like for an example, the oxymoron, do that good mischief which may make the isle thine own forever, Act 4, Scene 1. Hyperbole such as, your tale, sir, would cure deafness, Act 1, Scene 2, line 106. The idea of antithesis. Ferdinand's opening speech in Act 3, which I was going to read to you, but I don't have time before I finish the lecture now. I'm getting the wind up. Ferdinand's speech to open Act 3, you can read that for yourself. When you look at the antithesis in the words that he uses, it's very important. And that opening speech in Act 3 uses that technique to engage the audience. Let's look at all those different images again that we have in it, and Shakespeare uses lots of water imagery in this, and you can refer that and link that back to the idea of water imagery that I talked about before. I think in the play the images, Caliban and Sycorax represent Earth, Ariel represents air. Also look at the use of clothing to describe character and how the Trincula and Stefano are engaged by the colourful clothing and the bright clothing, and how Prospero wears a cloak. And look at the role of that, the flashy clothes and what clothing people wear and what that represents in characters. And that's a theatrical thing as well as a staging thing. Well, I hope that's answered some of your questions about language techniques and dramatic techniques in Shakespeare. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about very specific things if you'd like to contact me through the channel. I'm sure that Total Education is more than happy to help you in answering those questions. So again, thank you for listening. Best of luck with your work, and please feel free to answer any questions. And don't forget, give us a like if you enjoyed the lecture, and if not, let us know why. And please visit TotalEducationCentre.com.au. I'm Bruce Pattinson. Good night.